I've told you many kinds of crime stories before. Stories about crimes that were committed, what happened afterwards, how the investigation unfolded, how the accused were caught, and how they were eventually punished. But today's story is difficult to put into any particular category. And there's a very specific reason for that. Because technically, no crime was committed, at least no actual murder ever took place. There were threats, there were warnings, there were references to possible killings, there was fear. There was an enormous amount of psychological pressure, but thankfully, no one was actually killed. And yet, despite the fact that no crime was ultimately carried out, something extraordinary happened. For nearly 4 or 5 years, an entire family of 5 lived under an unbelievable amount of stress, pressure, and fear. An organization as powerful as the FBI became involved. Private investigators were hired. Security companies were brought in. Handwriting experts examined the evidence. Forensic teams examined the letters. Everyone tried to solve the mystery, and almost everyone failed. Even today, the identity of the person behind those mysterious letters remains unknown. This is the story of an American family, a house, and a mysterious person who called himself the Watcher. The story begins in the United States, in the state of New Jersey, more specifically in a town called Westfield. Westfield is located roughly 45 minutes from New York City. It is a quiet, peaceful, upper-middle-class community, the kind of place where people generally expect to live a comfortable and safe life. Westfield isn't usually associated with major crimes or violent incidents. In fact, it has often been described as one of the more peaceful communities in that area. But there was one infamous incident in the town's history. Back in 1970, a man named John List murdered his wife, his mother, and his 3 children inside their Westfield home. The case made national headlines. After that, there were a few smaller incidents over the years, but nothing that fundamentally changed Westfield's reputation as a peaceful community. Then came 2014. And that was the year everything changed for one particular family. In June 2014, a man named Derek, who lived in New York, was working in a senior position at a life insurance company. He had come from an ordinary family, but through education and his career, he had done quite well financially. When Derek turned 40, he decided it was time for his family to move into a larger home. Derek and his wife, Maria, had 3 children. At the time, the children were approximately 5, 8, and 10 years old. The family had been living in a 3-bedroom house. But as the children grew older, Derek and Maria decided that they need more space. So, in June 2014, they purchased a beautiful 6-bedroom home in Westfield, New Jersey. The property was located at 657 Boulevard. The house was large, beautiful, and located in a desirable neighborhood. The purchase price was approximately $1.4 million. Like most people who buy an expensive new home, Derek and Maria decided to make some changes before moving in. They wanted to repaint the house, make repairs, and decorate it according to their own preferences. So, they hired workers. Renovation work began. The plan was simple. Once everything was finished, the family would move in. But about 15 days after purchasing the house, something happened. Derek visited the property to check on the renovation work. The family had not moved in yet. The house was still being worked on. And then Derek noticed an envelope. It had been left at the house. He picked it up. Inside was a letter. The letter was written in English, and the message was extremely strange. It began with what appeared to be a welcome. It essentially said, "Welcome, new neighbor. Allow me to welcome you to 657 Boulevard. How did you find your way here? Did the power contained within 657 Boulevard somehow call you here?" The letter went on to explain that 657 Boulevard had supposedly been extremely important to the writer and his family for generations. According to the letter, the writer's grandfather had watched over the house beginning in 1920. Then, beginning around 1960, his father had taken over that responsibility. And now, according to the writer, it was his turn. He claimed that his family had been watching over the house for generations. He then mentioned the hundreds of cars that passed in front of the property every day. He said that perhaps he was sitting inside one of those cars. Maybe Derek would look out the window and see him. He also mentioned the people who walked along the street. He suggested that he could be any one of them. A person walking past the house, a person sitting in a car, someone watching, someone waiting. And then came the strangest part. The writer did not give his real name. Instead, he signed the letter as the Watcher. Derek read the letter. At first, he wasn't extremely concerned. He thought it might be some kind of bizarre prank. Maybe someone in the neighborhood was trying to scare the new owners. So, he put the letter aside. The renovation work continued, but about a week later, another envelope arrived. Another letter. And this time, the tone was much more disturbing. The letter mentioned Derek's children. The writer said he had seen them. He knew there were 3 children. Then came a chilling question. Did you want your house filled with young blood? The writer asked whether the family's old house had become too small for their growing family. Or perhaps greed had brought them to a larger house. The letter then said something even more disturbing. Once the writer learned the children's names, he would be able to draw them toward him. Then the letter began discussing the bedrooms. It asked whether the children would sleep in the smaller rooms. Would Derek and Maria sleep on the second floor? Would their bedroom windows face the street? The writer said he would know when the family moved into the house. He wanted to know when they were moving, because once he knew who slept in which bedroom, he could plan what he would do next. This time, Derek was genuinely frightened. This was no longer some harmless prank. The person writing the letters appeared to know things about his family. He knew they had 3 children. He appeared to know where they might sleep. He knew the family was preparing to move into the house, and he was telling them that he was watching. Derek decided to contact the previous owner. He explained that he had received 2 strange letters from someone calling himself the Watcher. The previous owner listened carefully. Then he said something that made the situation even stranger. He told Derek that he had lived at 657 Boulevard for approximately 23 years, and during those years, he had never received a letter like that. But then he remembered something. A few days before he moved out of the house, he had received a similar letter. That letter had asked him why he was leaving. Why was he abandoning the house? The writer had warned that someone else would come and destroy the property. The previous owner said he had assumed it was nonsense, so he threw the letter away. He didn't even remember where he had discarded it, but now the new owners were receiving letters too. That was enough to make him concerned. Derek and Maria went to the Westfield police department. They showed the officers the letters. They explained everything. The police initially considered several possibilities. Maybe it was a neighbor. Maybe someone had wanted to buy the house but couldn't. Maybe someone was angry that Derek and Maria had purchased it. Maybe someone simply wanted to intimidate the new owners. The police promised to investigate, and they did. But there was one major problem. They couldn't find the writer. There was no obvious suspect, no clear motive, no useful surveillance footage, no fingerprints that immediately solved the mystery. Nothing. Then July arrived, and another letter appeared. The 3rd letter. By this point, Derek and Maria had made a decision. They were not moving into the house, not until they knew who was behind the letters. The threats were becoming increasingly personal. They were frightened for their children's safety. Then they opened the third letter, and this time the watcher revealed information that made the situation even more terrifying. The letter asked, "Where are you? 657 Boulevard is missing you." The writer then mentioned the children's names, their date of birth, even their nicknames. The writer addressed the children by name. He knew who they were. He knew how old they were, and he wanted them to come to the house. He again asked who would sleep in which bedroom. He said he wanted to know the sleeping arrangements because that would make his future plans easier. Derek and Maria are now terrified. How could a stranger know the names and even date of birth of their children? How had this person been watching them? How long had he been watching them? And most importantly, what did he actually want? The letter contained another warning. The writer reminded them that 657 Boulevard was more than a century old. He warned them not to destroy or alter the house. If they continued the renovations, there would be consequences. At this point, Derek and Maria stopped the renovation work completely. The police advised them not to take unnecessary risks, so the workers stopped. The house remained empty and the investigation continued. But once again, there was no breakthrough. Derek and Maria decided they needed more help, so they hired private investigators. The private investigators examined the letters. They investigated the neighborhood. They looked for possible suspects. They tried to identify the person behind the threats, but they also failed. Nothing, no solid clue, no definite suspect, no answer. The case was becoming increasingly bizarre. Derek worked in a senior position at an insurance company, and he had significant resources. The property was worth approximately $1.4 million. There was a huge financial investment involved, but now the family didn't even feel safe entering the house. And then the story reached the media. News about the mysterious letters spread. A family had purchased an expensive home in Westfield, and someone calling himself the Watcher was threatening them. The case attracted enormous attention. At this point, the matter was considered serious enough for the FBI to become involved. The FBI began examining the letters. They studied the language, they studied the handwriting, they examined the information contained in the letters, and they began monitoring the house. Because the Watcher had claimed that hundreds of cars passed the property every day, he could be sitting in any of them. He had also claimed that he could be one of the pedestrians walking along the street. So, investigators watched the property. They paid particular attention to the windows, the bedrooms, the areas where someone could potentially observe the house without being noticed. They considered the possibility that someone in the neighborhood was involved. Neighbors were investigated. One by one, they were examined, but no obvious suspect emerged. Then, forensic experts became involved. Investigators examined the envelopes. There was a potential clue. The envelopes had been sealed using saliva. Forensic testing reportedly indicated that the saliva belonged to a woman. Now, investigators had another question. Who was the woman? Could she be the watcher? Could she have been helping someone else, or was the result simply another dead end? Potential suspects in the neighborhood were examined, but once again, nothing. Then handwriting experts were brought in. They studied every letter. They compared the handwriting against samples from various people in the area. Again, nothing. The case seemed to be going nowhere. The local police had no answer. The private investigators had no answer. The FBI had no answer. The forensic experts had no answer. The handwriting experts had no answer. And Derek and Maria were left with the same question they had been asking from the beginning. Who was the watcher? The question remained unanswered. Who was the watcher? And perhaps even more importantly, why was this person so obsessed with 657 Boulevard? Derek and Maria were now facing a difficult decision. Should they eventually move into the house, or should they walk away from the entire property? Time was passing. The renovation had started. The family still hadn't moved in. And the letters had turned their dream home into a source of constant fear. Eventually, Derek and Maria made a decision. For the sake of their children, they would not move into 657 Boulevard. Instead, Derek decided they should sell the property. They would take whatever loss was necessary and buy another home somewhere else. At first, they hoped selling the house would be relatively easy. After all, it was a beautiful 6-bedroom property in an attractive neighborhood. But by this point, the story had reached the media. News reports were circulating about the mysterious letters. Anyone who searched the address could find the story, and potential buyers began backing away. Who would want to spend millions of dollars on a house where a mysterious person had threatened the family living there? Derek had already investigated and invested a huge amount of money into the property. He had purchased it for approximately $1.4 million. He had also spent money on renovations and improvements. He expected the value of the property to increase. Instead, he was having trouble finding anyone willing to buy it. The house sat on the market. Months passed, then more months, still no buyer. The watcher had disappeared. There were no more letters for a while, but the mystery remained. Derek couldn't move into the house, and he couldn't sell it either. Eventually, the years began to pass. 2014 became 2015, then 2016, and still no answer, no identity, no arrest, no explanation, and no fourth letter. Finally, in 2017, Derek decided that if he couldn't sell the house, he would rent it out. At least that way, the property could generate some income while he waited for a buyer. A tenant eventually agreed to rent 657 Boulevard. The person moved into the house. For a while, everything appeared normal. The tenant knew about the strange history of the property, but the rent was relatively affordable, and the house itself was attractive. So he decided to live there. Then another letter arrived, and this time the letter was addressed directly to the tenant. The watcher had returned. The message was threatening. The writer warned the tenant not to damage 657 Boulevard. If he did, something could happen to him. The letter suggested that his car could suddenly crash, his house could catch fire, he could become seriously ill, something could happen to his family, someone he loved could suddenly disappear, someone could mysteriously die. The writer mentioned accidents involving cars, planes, bicycles, and other possibilities. The message was essentially a warning. Don't damage this house. The tenant was terrified. For years, the property had been connected to a mysterious letter. Actually, a bunch of mysterious letters. Now, he was receiving one himself. He decided he didn't want to take the risk. He left the house. Once again, 657 Boulevard was empty. The year was now 2017. Then came 2018 and eventually 2019. The property still had not been sold. Derek had lost years dealing with the house. He had lost money. He had spent money on investigators. He had dealt with the media. And most importantly, he had lost his peace of mind. Finally, in 2019, someone expressed interest in purchasing the property. The buyer worked for an insurance company and knew about the history of the house. Despite everything that had happened there, he was willing to buy it. A deal was eventually reached. Derek sold 657 Boulevard. The house that had originally cost him approximately $1.4 million was eventually sold at a significant loss. The exact financial figures have been reported differently, but the important point is that Derek lost a substantial amount of money on that property. Later, when Derek was asked why he was willing to take such a huge financial loss. His answer was surprisingly simple. He said that money wasn't the most important thing anymore. His family's safety was. His family's life was more important, and his peace of mind was even more important. He had already spent years living under the psychological pressure created by the watcher. So, even though selling the house meant losing a significant amount of money, he was willing to do that because he wanted his family to be able to live normally again. Derek and Maria eventually purchased another home a short distance away. They moved there with their 3 children, and after leaving 657 Boulevard, something strange happened. Nothing, no more letters, no more threats, no more messages. No one contacted them again. And the new owner of 657 Boulevard also did not appear to receive any more letters. At least, none were publicly reported. But the mystery didn't disappear. Instead, it became even bigger. Who was the watcher? Why was he so obsessed with this particular house? What was his connection to 657 Boulevard? Was there actually a family that had watched over the property for generations? Was the story about his grandfather and father true? Was there really a person who had been observing the house for decades? Or was the entire story something completely different? Investigators looked into the history of the property. They examined the previous owners. They looked into people who had lived there over the decades. But nothing produced a definitive answer. Some people eventually developed their own theories. One theory suggested that Derek himself could have been responsible for the letters. The theory was based partly on his financial situation. Before purchasing the 1.4 million property, Derek had reportedly lived a more modest lifestyle. He had taken on significant financial obligations. Some people speculated that perhaps he realized he could not comfortably afford the property, and the watcher story was created as an explanation for why the family couldn't move in. According to that theory, the letters could have been fabricated. But there was a problem. That theory was never proven. There was no definitive evidence showing that Derek had written the letters, and the investigation never established that he was the watcher. Other theories pointed towards neighbors. Some people believed someone in the area might have been angry about the purchase. Others believed the person could have had a personal connection to the property. Some thought the writer might have been obsessed with preserving the historic character of the house, and some believed the watcher could have been more than one person. But again, none of these theories were conclusively established. The identity of the watcher remained a mystery that had survived police investigators, private investigations, FBI involvement, forensic examination, handwriting analysis, and years of speculation. Eventually, the story became famous enough that it attracted the attention of the entertainment industry. The story of the Watcher was later adapted for television, including a Netflix series inspired by the events. But even after the story became widely known, one question remained unanswered. Who was the real person behind those letters? Nobody knows for certain. Today, 657 Boulevard is no longer an abandoned property. People have lived there. The house has changed ownership. Life has continued. But the mystery remains attached to its history. And that is what makes this case so unusual. There was no murder, there was no confirmed attack, there was no physical crime committed against the family. But there were threats, there were warnings, there were references to murder, there were threats involving accidents, there were threats against children, and there was a person who seemed to know an alarming amount about the family. Yet, despite all of that, the person behind the letters was never identified. And perhaps the strangest part of all is the claim made in the very first letter. The Watcher said that his grandfather had watched this house, then his father, and now it was his turn. If that claim was true, who were they? Why had they been watching 657 Boulevard? And why did this person believe he had the right to decide who could live there? Was it an obsession? Was it revenge? Was it a family tradition? Was it simply an elaborate attempt to frighten the new owners away? Or was there another explanation that investigators never discovered? We may never know, because after all these years, the Watcher remains exactly what he called himself: a watcher. Someone who claimed to be nearby, someone who claimed to be watching, but someone whose true identity has never been confirmed. And that is why the story of 657 Boulevard remains one of the strangest unsolved mysteries in modern American true crime. No murder, no confirmed physical attack, no identified suspect. Just a house, a family, a series of terrifying letters, and an unknown person watching from somewhere in the shadows.
So that's all for tonight. I hope you enjoyed the story, and if that's the case, please do hit the like button. And if you want to hear more of such real incidents based on crime and horror, please do subscribe to this channel. Good night. Take care.